Hello and good morning, everyone. Hi, my name is Carmen, and I am with the Public Outreach and Engagement Committee of the Jane Goodall Institute, Singapore. Welcome y'all to today's JGIS ConservAction Lecture. There's still some people coming in, but I'm going to go ahead and start so we won't be running over time for too long. So if you've attended our previous lecture in April, you will recall that our theme for this year's ConservAction Lecture Series is Tales from Eko Eko, where we invite photographers whose works are featured in the Eko Eko project to share with us their beautiful images and their insight. And if you're not familiar with Eko Eko, it is a photography project jointly presented by Jane Goodall Institute and Roots and Shoots chapters across Asia Pacific. By featuring photos of wildlife and nature in the region, the project hopes to harness the power of photography to inspire people to discover and protect our biodiversity. And if you haven't visited the site yet, do check it out, and you'll see works by many renowned photographers whose including, our speaker today, who will be showcasing, sharing, guiding us on a journey into hidden Borneo. But before we get to the presentation, may I remind you to please mute your microphones throughout to minimize disruption. And also do note that the webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be uploaded to the JGIS YouTube channel, where you'll also find recordings of our past lectures. And lastly, please use the chat box to ask questions if you have the questions that you have for our speaker, and we'll get to them after the presentation. Okay, now that we've taken care of the housekeeping items, I'm going to bring in Dr. Andy Ang, who is the president of JGIS. And Andy will be telling you a little bit more about JGIS. Andy, over to you.
Thanks so much, Carmen, and welcome everyone to this talk. I'll just go to a little bit about what we do at JGIS and what this is all about for the lecture series. So the Jane Goodall Institute is a global nonprofit focused on inspiring individual action to improve the understanding and welfare and conservation of the natural environment and to promote coexistence between people and wildlife. The Jane Goodall Institute Singapore was founded in 2007 to continue Dr. Jane Goodall's work in Singapore. We have two strategic pillars to guide us in our activities. One is the Roots and Shoots, where we work a lot with the students and the teachers to build capacity in students through sharing more about information and knowledge, and to also guide them through their individual projects. We also have the ConservAction, which essentially means action for conservation. And here we promote human-wildlife coexistence and nature conservation by supporting scientific research and also inspiring and engaging the general population through events such as today's event, content creation, and also partnerships. For those of you who just joined us for the first time to the lecture series, here's a little background on how we all started. In 2017, when Dr. Jane Goodall was in Singapore, she was sharing more about how it is important to understand human behaviors and also animal behaviors in order to find ways for different species to live together harmoniously and also to integrate the natural environment within our priorities, especially when it comes to living in an area like Singapore, where it's densely populated. From Singapore, we went around the world, starting from Asia. We brought in speakers, and at that time, it was in-person events where we have speakers from Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand, sharing more about their work with wildlife and also the local communities in order to preserve their natural environment. We ended the Asia tour with Camille talking about the conservation activities in Laos. And Dr. Jane visited us again in 2019, where we had the DPM Heng Swee Kiat with us. And here, Dr. Jane was sharing a lot more about how our transformation from a garden city into a city in nature is essential for urban cities like Singapore to have moving forward. And then we went to Africa, where speakers talk about the conservation and rescue work involving chimpanzees and also baboons. And then over to Central South America, where we look at spider monkeys, woolly monkeys, and capuchin monkeys. 2021, last year, we had Dr. Jane with us again, but this time virtually. And here we were sharing a lot more about the benefits that nature can bring to us, especially when it comes to physical and mental health. And this year, like Carmen was sharing, so I won't go into much detail. This is a collaboration between the Jane Goodall Institutes and Roots and Shoots chapters across Asia Pacific to showcase the diverse wildlife through photography and how we can all act together in order to preserve our beautiful wildlife and environment. So here's a showcase of some of the photos that the photographers contributed. And we had our first talk to Eko Eko with speakers talking about marine biodiversity in Singapore. And today we have Chien with us to share more about Borneo and his incredible work through wildlife photography. So if you're interested to support more of our volunteer-run events, do consider donating to us through our website or through Pay Now option. Thank you very much, and over to you, Carmen.
Thank you, Andy. Okay, so now I'm going to bring in my JGIS co-host, Dr. Vilma Di Rosario, who is going to introduce our speaker, Chien. So Vilma, over to you.
Thanks, Carmen, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us yet again for our ConservAction Lecture Series. I have the privilege today to introduce Chien. Chien is a biologist and he's turned professional wildlife photographer, started his career in environmental education in California. And because he loved the rainforest, the tropical rainforest so much, he moved to Borneo in 1996, where he now lives. Since 2003, he's been a wildlife photographer, as a career. And now he also does wildlife tours. He takes people on tours to Malaysia, Indonesia, New Guinea, Sri Lanka, and Madagascar for now. Might be more later on. He's also an honorary research fellow at the Institute of Biodiversity and Environmental Conservation at the University of Malaysia, Sarawak. Chien's work, I think many of you know Chien's work. His work in photography captures very rare and endangered species beautifully, and he uses his images to interest people in conservation and also to educate them about the wonderful natural heritage that we have and what we can do to make a difference. So I have honor of inviting Chien now to give his talk. Chien, please.
Hi, good morning. Thanks so much, Vilma, for the very kind introduction. I hope everybody can hear me all right. Yes, it's really a pleasure to be here today with everybody. I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience, and I'm really honored to be a part of this series that's been put together by Jane Goodall Institute of Singapore. If you're not familiar with the talks that they put on, as Andy mentioned, they're doing a whole series. Please do check them out. There's some wonderful resources there, some great events. As well, please have a look at the Eko Eko virtual online exhibition, which has really showcased some amazing wildlife photographer from a great assortment of photographers across Malaysia. And I hope you have a chance to look at some of the very inspiring images there. So before I get started here, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, that's coming up all right. So the title of my talk today is Hidden Borneo. And what I'm going to be sharing is some stories and some experiences about camera trapping in the rainforests of Borneo. And by this, I don't mean your standard trail cams. What I've been working with is customized DSLR camera traps, which have the potential to take high quality photos, something quite different from your standard camera trapping. And this is something that's been a very important arsenal in my tool of equipment for procuring photos of wildlife in Borneo, many of which are very shy and elusive, that are difficult to see and capture photos of with more traditional methods. So camera trapping is becoming increasingly so an essential tool in that respect. A bit of background about myself. I'm not initially, I'm not from Borneo myself. I grew up in California and basically moved out here as soon as I finished my degree in ecology. And I'd always dreamed of coming to the tropical rainforest. It's a place that, of course, it's overflowing with biodiversity. And my own personal interests have spanned a great assortment of things, ranging from insects, which was my initial impetus to get outdoors, to plants, to birds, amphibians, mammals, and pretty much just everything in the rainforest. And in 2003, nearly 20 years ago, I decided that I would turn my hobby of nature photography into a profession, because this was a way that I could encompass all of my interests in nature. And if you've ever been to Borneo, you'll realize that this is a fantastic place to be if you have an interest in nature. It really is a land of discovery. You feel like you're on the forefront of the edge of science, and there's no end of amazing things to photograph in the rainforest here. But before I get into the photography itself, I want to give you just a brief introduction to orient you about Borneo. I think we have a lot of local people joining in the talk today, but I know there's some people signing in from overseas, and some of you may not have had the opportunity to visit Borneo yet. So I want to give you a little intro to where the island is. Borneo, of course, is the third largest island in the world, just a tad smaller than New Guinea. And it straddles the equator. So it is very, very tropical. I'm based on the west coast here in Kuching, the capital city of Sarawak. And it has good access to many parts of Borneo. Now, once upon a time, and still to a large degree, Borneo is covered with tropical lowland rainforest that originally stretched pretty much from coast to coast. The rainforest in Borneo is also the tallest in the world. Some of the trees in Borneo have been recorded topping the scales at 100 meters. So it's a very interesting rainforest, different than a lot of other rainforests around the world. And of course, it is absolutely overflowing with biodiversity. It has extremely high diversity in plants, insects, amphibians, mammals. In so many ways, a lot of the biodiversity in Borneo still requires a lot of documentation. New species are being discovered pretty much every year. And there's a lot of species that have already been named that we still don't know much about, that perhaps the behavior or the distribution or even good quality photos basically don't exist. Now, one of the things about the Borneo rainforest in particular is some people may step into it for the first time if they're unfamiliar, and their first reaction is, where are all the animals? And sometimes this is because people have grown up watching too much Nat Geo Wild or the Discovery Channel, and they are under this impression that the rainforest is just exploding with animals left and right. And this couldn't be further from the truth. Yes, you will see birds if you seek them out. And if you go out in the daytime, the mammals you'll see will be squirrels and maybe some primates. But by and large, a lot of the inhabitants of the rainforest are secretive, they're shy, they're elusive, they're afraid of predators, and there are predators everywhere. And they tend to hide themselves either by camouflage or by being secretive in their habits, such as coming out only at night. And so a lot of these creatures, it requires a lot of effort to not just see, but if you want to obtain photographs of them, you have to really try very hard. It's very different, for example, than going on a safari in Africa or some river safari in Pantanal in Brazil, where you can basically sit back and watch the animals left and right. In Borneo, you really have to try hard to find these extraordinary creatures. They're there, but they're hidden. Now, camera trapping has changed all that. Of course, when I say camera trapping, I'm talking about all aspects of camera trapping. This has been around for many decades. Obviously, in the early days, camera trapping used film, but with the advent of digital cameras, it has become much more easy to use, and it is now a fundamental tool for biologists everywhere to use camera traps to detect the presence of animals, even behavior, identifying individual animals. And it's been a game changer in our knowledge about a lot of wildlife, especially tropical wildlife. For example, many mammals in Borneo, such as this example here in the bottom, this is the Bornean bay cat, which is an endemic, one of the least known cats in the world, was previously known only from a handful of specimens and sightings. But since the camera trap technology has become so readily available, bay cats are turning up on these trail cams all across the island. They're still shy, they're still very rare, but our understanding about their distribution has completely changed. They're much more widespread and prevalent and existing in habitats that previously people had no idea bay cats could survive there. So camera trapping has really changed our knowledge about species like this. Now, of course, traditional camera trapping has its limitations. As a tool for wildlife research, it's fantastic. It can identify the presence of animals, even show behavior, but usually the quality of the images themselves is no more than what you would need for identification. For example, these two Bornean banded civets, this is actually a screen grab from a video. It's perfectly sufficient for identifying animals, but very rarely do you end up with an image that you can use for, say, a more popular publication. Now, the type of camera trapping I want to talk about today, DSLR camera trapping, is using customized camera traps, basically a DSLR digital camera that you would use for more traditional type of photography, and arranging a setup so that you can obtain images rather than this. You ideally can obtain images something more like this. Also, the Bornean banded civet. Now, these also have value potentially as part of the scientific record, but they also serve additional purposes because these images can be used for more general publications. They're aesthetically or potentially aesthetically pleasing, that perhaps they can help to inspire other people to take an interest in conservation and nature awareness. Now, DSLR camera trapping, it's much more complex than using a traditional trail cam. With traditional trail cams, you're talking about a single unit that you simply put the batteries and the SD card in, you tie it to a tree and turn it on, and everything's done. So basically, it's a very simple setup, which is very different from a customized DSLR camera trap. This is just a sample setup. This is actually an old setup of mine, but it gives you an idea of the different components that go into making a complete DSLR camera trap setup. Obviously, you've got the camera, and in this case, it's in a waterproof enclosure. You also have a separate piece, which is the sensor. In this case here, it's divided between the transmitter and the receiver, because this is an active infrared beam. I'll get more into the different types of sensors later. And you also have your lighting, which up here you can see in the upper right is one of the flash units. You can't see the other one in this setup here. Those will usually be, of course, covered with rain covers when the trap is complete. So there are many different parts that go into making a DSLR camera trap setup. And you can have multiple flashes, sometimes 3, even 4 flashes or more. And all of these pieces take time to set up. So it's much more involved than setting up a simple trail cam. And as you get into doing multiple camera traps for work, the amount of gear you're hauling into the forest can be enormous. This is right here on just some of the gear on the table. This is not even a complete setup for a set of 5 DSLR camera traps. And if you don't have any porters to help you carry this into the forest, good luck, because it ends up being a lot of gear. And also quite expensive there because you're using DSLRs and all these flash units, everything adds up. So they do come with quite a price tag. I personally don't try to use super high-end cameras because you never know what's going to happen to your gear in the forest. But nevertheless, it is a considerable investment for to get into this type of photography. Now I just want to give you a brief breakdown of the different types of sensors that are used in DSLR camera trapping. I don't want to go into too much detail here, but obviously the sensors are a fundamental part of the camera trap. And this is basically the trigger. The sensor is what will detect an animal or movement, and it will send a signal to the camera either by a cable or by a wireless signal so that the camera will take a photo. Now, when I first got started in this type of camera trapping, this was over 15 years ago, initially we tried to use, I think my first setup was actually using a automatic door chime that you use in front of a shop door that will chime a bell when somebody passes through the door. But that's basically an infrared camera trap. And that's how a lot of these other infrared beams work as well. Now, since then, a lot of other sensors have come on the market, and many of the new ones are quite advanced. They're not only rugged and built to withstand the outdoors quite well, but they have a lot of features that enable you to program specific shooting sequences, even programming them to only take photos at night or during the day. And there are advantages to disadvantages, a lot of these. They're not all the same. So I'm going to go over just a few of these. You can see here the big one on the left. This is the Photoshop. This is one of the early kits that I used. It's a great trigger mechanism. It's extremely fast, very responsive, but it is large. And it obviously taking a series of these into the forest is a whole nother backpack load of gear. It also doesn't last particularly long, it's a very high battery consumer. There's another one here just to the right of it, the Cognosis Range Ir, which is a nice entry-level sensor. It uses a reflect beam. I'll explain that in a little bit. Uses a standard set of batteries, but also the battery life is not that long. Cognosis also produces a much more advanced sensor called the Saber, which actually uses an infrared pulsed laser that is extremely responsive and can not only detect when something passes in front of it, but it can measure the distance of the object in front of it so that you can set it up to trigger only when something is at a very specific range. The one in the upper right, the Trailmaster, is a bit of an older model, but it still is a fantastic sensor. It actually uses an infrared direct beam. So you have a transmitter and a receiver. And if the beam is broken, it triggers the camera. It has a great advantage that the battery life is very long, and it is customizable with different programs as well. Today, most of my camera traps use the sensor on the bottom right. And of all these, this is the only sensor that actually has a passive infrared detection system. And I'll get a little into that on the next page here, where I'm going to show you how these sensors work, just very briefly. So the top one, as I mentioned, the Trailmaster, it uses an active infrared beam, which is direct from the transmitter on the right to the receiver on the left. And only when that beam is broken does it send a signal to the camera. Similar to this, that also uses an active infrared beam, is the Range IR. The difference is you do not have a two-piece setup. What it has is the transmitter and the sensor are in a single unit. And this emits an infrared beam, and it requires an object to pass in front of it to reflect that beam back at the sensor. And when it does, that will trigger the camera. It actually works very well. A lot of devices use a reflect beam. And of course, the different one at the bottom is the Camtractions passive infrared sensor. And this is different because it does not actually emit its own infrared beam. It basically has a couple sensors inside that detect infrared light in the environment and movement. And when there's an imbalance in this, or there's a movement between these two sensors, and you could detect that the infrared is moving, that's what triggers the camera. And there's a lot of advantages to this because it has a wider field of view, especially for something like video work, where if your subject enters anywhere within this zone, it will trigger the camera. But it also, of course, results in more false triggers because your subject may not necessarily be in the focal plane, or you may get some interference from things like sunlight or leaves moving in the wind that are reflecting sunlight, which may cause a false trigger. Nevertheless, the bottom sensor is the one that I use for the majority of my camera traps now because it's much easier to set up and it does have a long battery life. So setting up your DSLR camera trap basically involves, first of all, finding a correct location. I'm going to describe a few things later about how to determine that. Setting up all your gear, your sensor. There's obviously a lot of trial and error that goes in this. But of course, when you're testing your system, you always run through, make sure everything's running smoothly. The problem with this, of course, is you have so many components in a DSLR camera trap, and it only takes a single one of those to go wrong for the entire setup to fail. For example, if the sensor is not set up properly, or the camera is not set up properly, or even if the transmitter to the flashes is not set up properly, if any one of those fails, it's going to result in no images. Now, there are, of course, a lot of other problems with setting up camera trapping in Borneo. I have a lot of friends that do camera trapping in other parts of the world. Some work in arid zones, in deserts, basically, and I am always envious when I see their photos. They're able to set up their cameras and basically not worry about the weather or other interference. In Borneo, weather is a big, big issue. Of course, a lot of parts of the interior of Borneo are very wet. There are a lot of places that have rainfall exceeding 5 meters, and we're not talking drizzles, we're talking heavy, heavy downpours. So all of the equipment needs to be very, very thoroughly weather sealed. There's even problems with, no matter how well your equipment is weather sealed, is getting splashes on the front of the lens. So many things can go wrong with this. I've experimented with a lot of packaged camera enclosures, and I've yet to find any that are really 100% weather sealed for Borneo's climate. And I actually build my own enclosures, basically using modified pelican cases, which even those fail sometimes when their cameras are exposed to this weather for weeks and weeks. The other issue with having such heavy rainfall is if you ever set your camera trap close to a body of water, and I've taken my chances and done this before, the water level can change dramatically with just a single rainfall. And there have been cases where I've returned to collect my camera to find that the entire setup is actually underwater. There are a lot of other problems that you have to deal with in the rainforest as well. One we have in Borneo is ants. And there are quite a few problematic ants, but there are a few species which I don't understand why, but they somehow love to chew on plastic and particularly camera gear. And this is, I think on the right here, this is a Pheidoli or Pheidologeddon ants. These are one of the problem genera. And below you can see some of the cable protectors that I used to deploy for my camera traps. And it looks like they've been splashed with acid or something. But sometimes these get completely chewed through, and the cables inside can be destroyed by these ants. You can even get shorts that will fry the equipment. I've had in a few instances where the entire colony of ants, for some reason, decided to move inside the camera itself and the flash units. And for days afterwards, I was having ants emerge from all the orifices of the camera. So very easy to lose equipment for that. I have not found a solution that will solve this problem, but the fact that I use mostly wireless triggers now rather than cables means there's a lot less for insects to chew on. And the other thing you can do is obviously be very careful where you set your camera trap up, that it's not near one of these ant nests, because they will find it and they will make a mess of things. Other issues are, of course, with any camera trap is the human factor. This is not my setup, but this is a friend's setup in Kalimantan. There was a trail cam set up on this tree that was basically stolen by people, and the cable had been compromised. And this happens with some frequency. There's a lot of areas that if you set up where there are people trafficking the trail, if they don't like the camera trap or they fancy taking it for themselves, it's very easy to lose equipment this way. And you can chain your trap to the tree or use any security you want, but at the end of the day, if somebody wants it, they'll find a way to take your equipment. So fortunately, touch wood, I have not had this happen to any of my gear yet. And a lot of that is because I've been fortunate to usually work in very remote locations that don't see a lot of human traffic. Now, before I get into sharing some of the photos, I want to just talk about two different types of camera trapping. And I like to break this down into short-term camera traps and long-term camera traps. And this is the reason I differentiate between these is because they basically use different types of techniques, often different sensors as well. For short-term deployments, I'm talking about a camera trap that is set up to be sprung within a matter of hours, sometimes even faster than that. So it's not a setup that needs to last very long. And usually this is done where you have an organism, an animal that is coming frequently to a very specific location, such as a feeding site. And you can guarantee that there'll be something happening very quickly. So you don't need to worry about having the trap set up for very long periods of time. And for long-term deployments, this is a camera trap that's been set up that will last days at a minimum, and often multiple weeks or even months in certain cases. And these need to obviously have a different type of sensor that has the battery capacity to last that long. And in fact, all the components of the camera trap need to be done in such a way that they last very long. Yeah. Now, of course, I still call all of these camera traps, regardless of the type of sensor that they use. But the fact that makes them in common is that they're all what we call remotely triggered. So these are photos that have been taken by us that was triggered by a sensor rather than a person pressing the trigger of the camera directly. So I'm going to share with you a few photos that I've taken on some of these different setups and a few of the stories behind them. I'll start off here. These are some of my short-term camera traps. This is something that have been done over just a period of several hours. This is a shot I took, I think this is about 8 years ago in northern Borneo. And it shows a long-tongued nectar bat coming into wild durian flowers to feed on the nectar. These bats are, in fact, one of the main pollinators of wild or even plantation durian trees. And their presence is very important for the production of durian fruit. If you have a close look at the face of the bat, you can see specks of yellow pollen on its face, and that's how they pollinate the flowers. This setup was actually taken quite high off the ground. If I recall correctly, it's maybe 6-7 meters up. We had to use a very tall ladder to get into the tree, set up the sensor. We mounted the flashes. In this case, it consisted of 3 separate flashes. And it was a bit of a tricky setup because it's difficult to determine exactly which direction the bat would enter the frame. But I was able to get a series of shots of this. More recently, I had the opportunity to photograph bats pollinating another species of durian. This is not a common species of durian. It's Dureocutogensis, which does have an edible fruit, but it's much rarer than the standard durian fruit most people may have tasted or you can find in standard markets. This photograph was actually taken at a semi-wild garden in Kuching. And I want to give a big shout out to Donna, who I think is in our audience today, for kindly allowing me the permission to arrange this camera trap setup in their tree in their backyard. This is a different species of bat that was actually pollinating these flowers. This is called a cave nectar bat, or some people call it the dawn nectar bat. It's a bit larger than the long-tongued nectar bat I showed in the previous photo, but they are also very important pollinators for durian flowers of multiple species. And these bats actually travel quite some distance. They often roost in caves, hence the name Eonycteris spelaea. But they've also been recorded roosting in attics of abandoned buildings. I think Bill may even mention that they have a population in Singapore under a bridge, if I'm not mistaken. But they are able to travel quite some distance in their nightly forays for nectar. So this trap was also set up in a tree. I think it must have been about 4 or 5 meters up in the tree. So in this instance, like the previous one, we had to arrange for flashes to be mounted on the branches, the sensor to be mounted quite high up, and the camera as well. So we're able to obtain quite a number of shots of this interaction. I think it was the first time that this bat had been photographed feeding on these flowers. And every set of flowers was only open for a single night. So we set up a trap over multiple evenings on different flowers and got the bats repeatedly visiting. So bats feature quite prominently in a lot of my short-term camera trap deployments, and they're great subjects because it's very difficult to get bats, to photograph bats in other ways. And they are also creatures of habit. Once you learn their feeding habits and are able to predict where they're going to be traveling, it enables you to get these glimpses into their behavior. This image here is a very special one for me because it involved several years to obtain this photographs. It's something that I had planned on for quite a while. It is a short-nosed fruit bat, which is one of our most common fruit bats here in Borneo, even inhabits a lot of urban areas. And it's feeding on a wild fig tree. This fig, it's called the Ficus Fistulosa, is also a very common fig species. It can be found usually not so much deep in the forest, but along forest edges and even in abandoned lots and roadsides all around Sarawak. I had great fortune of these trees growing around my property, and I live at the edge of a small nature reserve. And I had this photo in mind to obtain one day. So I actually propagated this fig by sowing the seeds and germinated a fig tree. It's a very fast growing fig, planted it at the back of my garden next to the nature reserve. And within, I believe it was less than 3 years, I had a tree of sufficient size that started to fruit. And as soon as it set fruit, the bats found it immediately. The odor, the sweet smell of these figs was easily detected by the bats. So I finally was able to set up this kind of photo that I had envisioned. And with the convenience of it being in my back garden, I was able to deploy a lot of flashes and try the setup in multiple directions before I could obtain an image that I wanted. Here we'll see a female bat that has just grabbed a ripe fig from the side of the tree, and rather than eating the fig on the tree, she'll take the fig back to a secure location, sometimes perching underneath a palm leaf or in the eave of an overhang, and that's where they'll eat the fig in safety. They don't actually eat the fig on the tree itself because that's quite dangerous. There could be predators waiting on the tree. It's not a secure location. So the bats are very quick. They fly in, quickly select a ripe fruit and take it off immediately. And it's at that precise moment that I was able to capture this image. Now, sometimes you get some surprising things with your camera traps. This is some insects, in this case, a pair of fruit-piercing moths that came into the trap I had set up for bats. And the camera sensor, or the triggering sensor, was precise enough that it was able to trigger the camera even for these moths. And here we see the moths flying into the fruit. They also detect it by the odor. And if you're not familiar with fruit-piercing moths, they are differing than other moths in that they have a very stout proboscis that can actually pierce the skin of the fruit, and that's how they suck the sweet juice out. These moths actually cause a lot of damage to fruit crops. Unless the crops are protected, they end up making all these holes in the fruit, particularly soft fruits like guava and I believe also papaya are very susceptible to these moths. Now, I'm going to show a few photos for long-term camera traps. And again, this is where you arrange a setup that is going to be in the forest for a period of days or even weeks. Now, I had the great fortune, or perhaps misfortune, of having this be one of the very first camera trap photos I ever got. And literally, when I set up this trap in the forest, which was at dusk, I walked away scarcely more than 50, 100 meters, and I could already see the flashes going off that this camera trap had been triggered. And in fact, this Malay civet came to my camera trap mere minutes after I had set it up. So I was very pleased when I checked the trap, and little did I believed that, you know, camera trapping would be smooth sailing thereon, but little did I know that that was just a lot of luck. There's a lot of disappointments in camera trapping. A lot of times you get misfires, nothing at all, or animals that aren't where you would hope them to be. So only very occasionally do you get shots that are precisely how you would like them. Now, we've had a lot of other experiences where animals will turn up on camera traps very shortly after setting them up. I'm always testing my traps after having them up, arranging all the components, and in some instances, just minutes, or even, I think in this case, it was maybe like an hour after I'd set up the trap. Here we have a greater mouse deer that passed by the same place I had been walking through. A lot of these animals, of course, are very shy and seldom seen unless you have the camera trap. And of course, sometimes you get even shyer animals. Clouded leopards, of course, are very difficult to see in the wild in Borneo. And it's primarily with camera traps that we can see that see where they are present in the forest. This particular set of images I'm going to share here is with a single individual clouded leopard that is a very special encounter for me, because it's an image also that took me several years to procure. This is in northern Borneo and a remote trail where I've been doing a series of camera trapping over several months. And eventually one of my camera traps on this remote ridge top turned up a large male clouded leopard that, according to the trap, this leopard would pass by the trail the same time once a week. So basically about every 6 or 7 days, this clouded leopard would walk down the same trail, going the same direction at the same time of day. And it was very exciting to get this glimpse into the behavior of this animal. But I wasn't 100% happy with this photo because it's hard to see the face of the animal. Although it's sharp, you can't see the eyes. And so I wanted to try for something different, but I ran out of time during that project. However, I was able to return to the same locality 2 years later, and I deployed another camera trap, but this time I set the camera trap on the same trail, but facing a different direction. I placed the trap a little further down the trail, facing the direction that the cat was walking. And this is the image I was able to obtain there. If you look closely at the spots of the animal, which are individual for every leopard, you can tell that it's actually the same male clouded leopard. So over several years, this animal was still walking the same trail at the same time of day. So it's very rewarding to be able to finally get a good image of this animal, especially after working with it for so long. Now, the other reason this photo was so fortunate is because just a few days after this photo was taken, the last photo on this trap showed this. And this is, of course, the Borneo pygmy elephant. And I believe this to be a lone male that came by and curiously sniffed and knocked over the transmitter of my camera trap, which you can't see. It's actually behind the buttress root on the right there, where the elephant's trunk is. And I'm quite pleased that the elephant didn't do anything to destroy the trap. I've heard stories of some elephants trampling camera traps. Basically, anything with a human scent, they just destroy it and it ruins the equipment. This elephant was extremely gentle, and it merely smelled and tipped over the transmitter and then moved away. Nothing was damaged, but unfortunately, that was the last photo that this camera trap took. Further down I did the same trail, actually, I was able to obtain this photo of a marbled cat, which is another very scarcely seen wild cat in Borneo. I was very fortunate to have a face-to-face encounter, I believe, with the same cat further down the trail the day before I went to check this camera trap for its images. So I believe that the cat I encountered was actually the same individual that walked through my trap. And it's also not just mammals that you get in your traps. This is actually the same setup that the marbled cat was in, and it's showing the great Argus pheasant. This is a bird that, despite its large size, it's very elusive and difficult to see in most of Borneo. You hear its call everywhere, but these birds, which are as large as a peacock, can just disappear in the forest, and they're extremely elusive. Now, here's another type of setup I did. This is also a number of years ago in northern Borneo. It's a trap that was just set up over a couple days, but it features a very interesting interaction between a mammal and a plant. Now, I was part of a research team that was studying this plant. This is the world's largest pitcher plant, Nepenthes raja, which is endemic to the Kinabalu region in northern Borneo. And the pitcher plants, of course, are generally carnivorous plants. They trap insects and other small prey. And some of the largest species, such as this one, which can hold several liters of water in the pitcher, the legend goes that people have found drowned mice and rats in these pitchers. However, the research that our team was doing was documenting that these plants actually are not aiming to capture these mammals. In fact, it's more of a mutual relationship. The plant is offering sweet nectar on the underside of the lid, and in return, the pitcher has a mouth that is shaped in such a way that when the animal feeds on the lid, it leaves its droppings in the pitcher below. And that's how the plant gets the majority of its nutrients. In the daytime, of course, these pitchers are visited by mountain tree shrews, which I was able to photograph using a hide and a long lens. But our team theorized that there was another animal visiting these pitchers at night once the sun went down. Tree shrews are only active during the day, but we noticed that there was other droppings being left in and around the pitcher. So I set up this camera trap, and lo and behold, we found that at night, these traps were visited by an endemic rat called the Kinabalu rat, or sometimes called the summit rat. And this was the first documentation that this rat actually feeds on the Nepenthes pitchers. And it may explain those old stories where people have found drowned rats inside these pitcher plants. Occasionally, and unfortunately for the rat, it slips off and falls into the pitcher below, and it becomes digested by the plant, just like the other prey that fall in. Now, I'm going to share with you just a couple images from a very recent camera trap setup. These are some images that just came off some of our traps over the past few months. This is another instance where a Bornean clouded leopard was found traversing a single trail. Again, a similar sort of behavior that we saw in the clouded leopard I showed earlier, and then this is also a male cat, the cat seems to traverse the same trail repeatedly, and it probably uses this path regularly to traverse its habitat. This is one of the first images that was obtained. Unfortunately, it's facing the wrong direction, but this same cat returned to the camera trap. I think it was that evening or a few days later, and in fact was so comfortable with the camera trap setup that it proceeded to do a fecal marking right in front of the camera trap. That's what this cat is doing here. And we have about at least 20 or 30 photos of this cat scraping and leaving it the droppings in front of the camera. And after it finished its business, it actually came up to the camera for a close sniff. Not long after that, I think it was just a couple days later, we have a Bornean masked palm civet that was very interested in the scent marking that the leopard left behind. Now, camera traps, DSLR camera traps may be different from the standard trail cams in that they're not traditionally thought of as supplementing research. They're much more difficult to use. The battery life doesn't last nearly as long. They're much more expensive. When you deploy a DSLR camera trap, you're looking at the most usually maybe 2, 3, 4 weeks, unless you use a lot of batteries. So they require regular maintenance, and I don't think they will ever replace the traditional trail cams, which can be are very simple to set up, and they can be deployed for months at a time. However, that being said, they still have the potential to have value for the scientific record. This is a case where one of my DSLR camera traps just a few years ago was able to capture an image of one of Borneo's rarest mammals, the Hoses civet, which is endemic to Borneo as well, and very scarcely known. Again, this is an animal that prior to widespread camera trapping was hardly known at all, only from a few specimens. And since camera trapping has become more prevalent, Hoses civet has been found to be much more widespread. And I believe this photo was the first ever DSLR photo taken of a wild Hoses civet. Now, we actually obtained it in one of Sarawak's national parks, Mulu National Park, where the Hoses civet was previously not known. So being able to have these images extend the known range of a rare species like this shows that DSLR camera trapping can still serve a purpose for the scientific record. Now, I know a lot of you in the audience may just be tuning in to hear stories about camera trapping, but I think we probably have some photographers out there as well who are interested in exploring DSLR camera trapping themselves. And I just want to give you a few insights and tips if you want to get into this type of photography. Now, I'm not going to get into great detail, such as camera settings and all these sorts of things, how to set it up. There are some wonderful tutorials online, and I'm going to give you some addresses that you can look up to get some great resources for that. Also, some resources on where to obtain some gear. But I'm just going to give some of my pieces of advice on what you can keep in mind to maximize your chances of getting high quality camera trap images. So I'm going to share a few tips. First and foremost, I think this is one of the most important, is get to know your subject. And by this, I mean understanding the behavior of the species that you want to photograph. This is fundamental to any type of nature photography, of course, but it's particularly true if you're trying to photograph rare and elusive species. Unless you understand where they're going to be feeding, where their habitat is, how they move through the forest, it's going to be very hard to obtain camera trapping photos. A great example of this, of course, is my experience with these fruit bats. where I had to first understand what these bats were feeding on, plant the tree that will attract them, and so I could basically guarantee that this behavior will be exhibited in the camera trap. And this is a learning process as well. By going through all the methods that you need to capture these images, you will learn a lot more about your subject in the process. Another thing I want to encourage is to be experimental with your setups. Now, there's a lot of simple and straightforward ways to set up your camera traps, but it's always a work in progress. And I get asked a lot from a lot of people for advice on how to set up camera traps. And I must confess, it's still a learning process for me as well. I'm always trying new things, setting up camera traps in trees or along rivers. Many different methods may be required to obtain photos of animals that are in different types of habitats. So don't be afraid to experiment with new types of setups. And also extremely important is persistence. Now, I can't emphasize this enough, but it is very easy to get discouraged with camera trapping. A lot of times you will set up your camera traps and you will find that there's either nothing there at all, or the animals didn't trigger the camera in the way that you had hoped. They're out of the frame, they're out of focus. And if you let yourself get hung up on disappointments, you'll get discouraged very quickly. This is part of camera trapping, and there's a big joy in that as well. It's you never know what you're going to get. You're always taking your chances. You can, of course, maximize your chances with knowledge of the subject, but at the end of the day, you're really at the mercy of luck here. Now, checking your camera trap at the end of a deployment, few weeks in the forest, is few things are as exciting as opening up your camera trap and looking at what images you found. Every once in a while, you will get something extraordinary, and that makes all of the persistence worth it. I also want to mention a few things about the ethics to consider in camera trapping. Now, there are more wildlife photographers now than ever before, and a lot of people do take a lot of concern about the welfare of their subjects when they photograph. But of course, we all are aware of stories where people do not care much about the welfare of their subject. There's people that abuse animals for photographs. And this has really painted wildlife photography in a bad light in some places. And it's the responsibility of all nature photographers to ensure that their subjects are as little disturbed as possible. Now, this is also true for camera trapping. And I have made mistakes in the past myself. This photo right here is one of the very first camera traps I had ever, camera trap images I had ever taken. This is, I think, over 14 years ago when I was just getting started. And I used a flash, a single flash here that was too powerful. And you can see the civet squinting its eyes because the light is too bright. Now, that may not cause any permanent damage to this animal, of course, but it does disturb it. And I've learned from my mistakes. Since then, I've found that if you use, of course, multiple flashes and increase the ISO of your camera, you can lower the power of the flashes so they're not blinding for the animals. Now, yes, there are some animals that are seemingly impervious to light. They don't care at all, but there are others that are more sensitive. And we have seen, especially I've seen some video camera traps where you can tell that the animals are disturbed by the presence of flashes and they retreat. So the ultimate goal, of course, is to, in the process of obtaining images, is to not do anything that will disrupt the natural behavior of your subject. Of course, oh, sorry, here's an example of using multiple flashes at a much lower setting. And you can see this is another species of civet that it's not squinting at all. In fact, this animal returned repeatedly to this particular trap and it doesn't seem to be distressed at all. Another thing to consider in photography is respect for privacy. Now, if you happen to set up your camera trap in areas where there are people, if you're near a village, you will occasionally get photographs of people, sometimes illegal hunting activity such as this. And this can result in some conflicts. There are a number of instances where people have destroyed or stolen camera traps. Some of that is just simple theft. They want to steal the trap, but other times people are concerned because they feel that camera traps are disrupting their privacy and they don't want a device in the forest that's photographing or filming them when they walk. So you have to always consider this when you're setting up in any area that people could be potentially there. Obviously, this involves obtaining permissions from the local communities so that they're not offended by having camera traps in the area, and hopefully that they will make sure that they don't get disturbed. So that's a very important consideration. Third, and this is also very important for conservation, is that we have to be very aware that disclosing locality information about sensitive species can be open the area up for poachers. Now, some animals obviously are much more prone to this than others, such as, for example, wild pangolins, which we do not disclose any information when we see those animals because poachers could potentially go in there immediately. But this is important for any such wildlife that could potentially be sensitive, is be very aware that sharing locality information of these photos could lead to poaching or other disturbance of the animal's natural habitat. Last but not least, I want to invite everyone to think about what they will do with their photos. If they're obtaining camera trap photos, you're potentially capturing images of rare species that could serve as an important scientific record. So I encourage you to make these available to people that may be doing research on this. This, for example, is another image of a Hose's civet. Again, a very rare endemic species in Borneo. But it's also important to remember that as nature photographers, it is a moral obligation that we should be portraying the natural world, not just in a truthful way, but to help to encourage others to take an active interest in this. And this is particularly why I feel that DSLR camera trapping can play a big role. By having high quality images of rare species, these photos can be used to attract people's attention, to make people aware that these species are existing sometimes in areas that we didn't even know that they are worthy of being protected. And once people become aware of that, the next step is having a concern for it. So photos always play a very important role in that. These are some recent publications. I was able to get photos that had been taken with camera traps. For example, a research journal on the left here. And a lot of these will open people's eyes to the presence and behavior of these shy and elusive animals. Now, before I close, I want to give people some resources that they can look into to find out more information about camera trapping techniques. You may want to take a screenshot of this page here or take a photo with your phone. These are some great online tutorials and ebooks about setting up your own camera traps. And some of these go into detailed techniques on camera settings and flash settings and how to trigger your camera, etc. A lot of great information here. And on the same vein, I want to give you these links here to some equipment suppliers that sell camera trapping gear. Of course, you can build a lot of these units completely from scratch, but if you're just getting started and you're not a tinkerer with electronics, I highly recommend buying some easy to use equipment to get started. And last but not least, I'd like to make a big shout out to a lot of the people who've helped make this possible, and also to some of my equipment sponsors, Camtractions, F-Stop, and Minifund. A big shout out to my wife, Pearl, who has followed me through crazy forest for so many years and helped shoulder a lot of the camera trapping gear to remote places despite lots of mud and countless leeches. And also a big shout out to my assistant, Gowan, who has tirelessly shouldered camera trapping gear up and down mountains and even gone back repeatedly to refresh batteries and remote camera traps. So a lot of work. Camera trapping is, in a lot of cases, it is really a team effort. And a lot of my photos would not have been possible without great help from everybody here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chien. Those are amazing. Thank you for taking us through hidden Borneo. Those images are really just, they're so beautiful. So, and I absolutely agree with you. I mean, it's great. And it's great that, you know, these images can show the world, you know, what species are actually living in all these, in the habitats that we don't really know about, that we don't really get to see. And hopefully, you know, this will inspire people to take an effort in conserving them. So those are great, really, thank you. And I see that there are many questions that have come in. So let's dive right into the Q&A. Vilma, would you like to ask the first question?
Yes, sure, Carmen. Thank you so much, Chien. It was just amazing, fascinating. Okay, first question, how to avoid false triggers?
Oh, good question, yes. It depends on what type of sensor you're using, of course. False triggers can be caused by anything. If you're using an active infrared beam, a branch or leaf or something waving in the wind across the infrared beam. For passive infrared sensors, which are much more prone to false triggers, there are certain ways to set it up. There are, for example, the Camtractions sensor has a sort of a brightness sensitivity dial that you can change the sensitivity of the sensor. If you're getting too many false triggers, you turn that down. But also the location of the trap will matter as well. If it's in an open area that gets a lot of sunlight or vegetation that may be blowing in the wind, you're prone to more false triggers. If you set it up in the still understory of the forest, you're less likely to get those false triggers.
Thank you. Carmen, next question.
Okay, we have quite a few. I think there are a lot of photographers in the audience. There are a lot of photography questions. And so there are a few also about, I guess, unintended triggers. And so the very first one was the questioner asked if rainfall will actually interfere with the infrared trigger.
Under ideal conditions, no. I've had a lot of photos of animals triggering the camera trap completely normally in the middle of a rainstorm. Now, that being said, we're talking some types of rain. There are these absolute torrential downpours sometimes. And I'm not sure yet if I'm not getting photos during those of animals because the rain is so heavy. Certainly some storms are so strong that they do seem to trigger some types of traps, including passive infrared traps. But that's the exception rather than the norm.
Okay. Vilma, next question to you.
Yes, a question that I also would like to ask, but a few people have been asking. It's regarding your choice of focal length and camera trap, settings. Like, how do you choose, and for the best capture?
Yeah, good question. I mean, this is something that's covered in some of the tutorials that I gave links to, but again, you have to take into account your scene, how much ambient brightness is there, how far away the camera is from the subject, and what you're photographing. If you're going for elephants, you're going to have very different settings than you're going for mice. Now, I tend to set a lot of my cameras sort of at what I've determined a mid-range of settings where, and this is from experience working in very particular conditions in shady rainforest understories. And this set of settings is usually good for relatively small to mid-ranged animals. It's a compromise between the amount of depth of field you get. I occasionally like to use a very tight frame if I'm very certain of my subject, such as some of the high-speed ones where you know what animal is going to be coming in. You can frame it much more accurately. But for long-term deployments where you're not sure if you're going to be getting a moon rat or a clouded leopard, you have to go for something sort of in between. And yes, it means that a moon rat will be very small in the frame and a clouded leopard will be very large in the frame, but these are always going to be compromises.
Thanks. Comment?
Yep. Okay. Let's see. How often do you retrieve your, I guess, the camera or the memory card?
Right. For long-term, I guess this is about the long-term camera traps. Usually we try to service the traps at least every 2 weeks. We've been finding that if it's an area that doesn't have a huge amount of animal activity, 3 weeks is sometimes fine. And sometimes we come back after 3 weeks and the batteries are still fine. You could probably push it a little more. It depends on a lot of things. The quality of the batteries that you're using, for example, but also what sort of triggerings you're getting. I did a camera trapping project in Madagascar a few years ago, and I set up a camera trap over this log in the middle of a trail. And I didn't realize, but there was a forest rat living under the log. The Madagascan forest rat it's quite a large rat. So it triggered the camera every time it went to and from its nest. And I came back, I think it was only like 10, 12 days, but I had maybe 600-700 photos of this rat. The flashes were completely done and spent because they had been just firing multiple times every day. I did get some other nice things on that trap, but it really depends on the frequency that the flashes are being used. If you only get a few triggers a week, your flashes might be good quite a bit longer. Now, when you're using non-cable connections, and in other words, if you're using wireless connections, you also have battery drain from the transmitters and receivers for example, the wireless flash communicators, and those actually consume a lot of battery power as well, particularly the receivers, because they're constantly waiting for this trigger signal from the transmitters. And we find that those are often some of the batteries that are, they expire the quickest. So yeah, sorry, to answer the question, my traps, usually 2 to 3 weeks is our average runtime.
Wilma?
Yeah, okay, another question. How do you know which track or trails to set up at? And I think you've answered this, but do you have help from local rangers and local trackers?
Yeah, great question. I actually wanted to mention that in my talk, but I forgot. This is in lines with getting to know your subject, and almost invariably having local knowledge is a huge asset to knowing where to place your camera traps. And this can be anything from working with indigenous hunters. Some of my experiences working with Penan people in northern Borneo have been great. They know how to read trails of wildlife. They can see the signs of animals, and that's a huge asset. Other instances, I've had the great fortune of being able to work with researchers who have done trail camera trapping on trails, and they know from those images and videos that, for example, certain species of wild cats, others that are frequenting particular trails. And when you have inside knowledge like this, you know exactly where you want to be setting up your camera traps. So that's a huge advantage as well. Occasionally, you're going in such remote areas, and we've done this as well, where there are no indigenous communities and no one to help you or to advise on where to set up your traps. And that's where it's important for you to learn yourself about how to read animal trails, look for sign, scat, scrapings. A lot of animals, of course, utilize natural features of the landscape, such as ridge tops or fallen logs, for example, going over stream valleys. They use natural features to traverse their habitat as efficiently as possible. And once you learn how to think the way an animal would be walking on the landscape, you can get very good ideas about where to set up your camera traps.
Thanks. Thank you. Carmen?
Yep. Okay. There are a couple of questions about tourism, because I think in Vilma's introduction, we understand that you also lead, I guess, trips into these remote locations. So we have a question here. Can you speak about how you mix camera trap imagery with ecotourism? Because it might be hard to get people interested in going into the jungle for wildlife that is very secretive. And so I guess the question is, how do you get people excited about your tours with your images? And what is the best way so far that you found to do that with tourists? And then another question is specific to Borneo. For somebody starting out, I think the question is, where is the best area to go in Borneo to do photographing mammals?
Okay, yes, sure. Yeah, I do lead, every year I lead a handful of wildlife and bird watching tours, some photography oriented trips as well. And in those cases, photography is always a big asset. Having images showcasing the rare species that you can see in a particular area is always a way to attract interest. In some places, we use photography to get people to or interested in visiting areas that may not yet have ecotourism facilities set up. We're actually in discussion with a few places like this where we've recently found interesting birds and mammals, and we want to help set up or help to initiate ecotourism in some of these areas, because obviously generating income for local communities through ecotourism is a great way to help in conservation of those forests. And one of the most fundamental things to get interest is to have good photographs of the fauna, the flora and fauna of those areas. So it's a great tool. The second part of the question, where in Borneo is a great place to see wild mammals? There are a number of areas, depends really on what type of mammals you're looking for. Just off the top of my head, Bako National Park here near Kuching is a wonderful place. Up in Sabah, I can't recommend places enough, like Kinabalu River, Danam Valley, Tabin. There's a wonderful reserve that's recently become a great place for night drives called Daramakot Forest Reserve. Lot of options to choose from. Down in Kalimantan, we have Tanjung Puting National Park. Really wonderful place to see a number of primates. Yeah, so we're very fortunate in Borneo that there's a great system of national parks, particularly in Sarawak and Sabah, that have fantastic facilities. Now this, of course, is for observing and photographing wildlife in a normal fashion. If you want to go to national parks and do camera trapping, you will need to have special permissions for that. But if you're going with standard photography equipment, that's completely fine.
Thank you, Chien. Okay, I'm mindful of time, so I want to ask, I'm going to ask this question because I think it's very important to address, and then I'm going to hand it back to Vilma to ask our traditional final question. But someone brought up, setting up traps. Do you ever bait them? So I think this is a very important point to talk about. So please.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I knew somebody would ask this question.
Mm-hmm.
I do use bait occasionally. Now, bait it's very different than what you would think of. It's not food. We're not intending to alter the behavior of an animal. The bait that we use occasionally is a scent-based bait. And this is something that will not necessarily lure animals or make them go out of their way. It's merely to have an incentive for them, if they're passing the trail, to stop and sniff for a few seconds longer, and hopefully to get a few more images in the process. You're not aiming to feed them. You're not aiming to alter their behavior from their original behavior. Some animals pay no attention to the odor at all. Others take a great interest in it. So it depends a lot on your subject. Obviously, if you're setting up a camera trap like the bats I have worked with and other animals for, such as the Kinabalu rat at the pitcher plant, we're not using any bait at all. These are already areas where we know the animals are naturally feeding and traveling to. Even some of the long-term camera traps, we don't need bait at all. If you know the trail, you don't need to add anything. The animal is going to be passing by there anyway. So it's only in certain instances that we do.
Okay, thank you. Vilma?
Yeah. So Chien, if you had a wish for wild and hidden Borneo, and your wish would be granted tomorrow, what would your wish be?
Sorry, is this, you mean about photography or a wish about Borneo?
About wild and hidden Borneo.
About wild and hidden Borneo. Okay, jeez, that's a tough question. Well, I think I wish that, and this is something that comes up a lot. I really wish that everybody would have a chance to experience how wonderful the rainforest is. And I don't mean everybody should drop everything that they're doing and become a conservationist or go back to school and study biology. What I mean is, I think all the issues that we are facing with conservation, even much larger issues like climate change, it's merely a factor of people not having the chance to understand how amazing and precious the natural world is. And if I could just, if everybody could have just, 1 hour out of their lives to just, maybe just as simple as stepping into the forest and experiencing how amazing it is, I think all that people would have a different outlook on things. So yeah, that would be my wish, I guess.
Thanks so much, Jen. And we really wish your wish comes true. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that wonderful talk. I'm sure everyone here enjoyed it. I did very much. Yeah, so we hope everyone will, go out and enjoy nature in Singapore or wherever you're at. Yeah. So back to Carmen, I think we need to take a photo, right?
Yes, thank you, Vilma, and thank you, Shan. I really, the images are so beautiful. So in a way, I wish it remains hidden because, it's hidden, and to stay the way it is. But at the same time, I wish more people could see it and appreciate it and join our effort in conservation. So thank you again. And I also want to thank the audience for all the wonderful questions. And before we go, we would like to take a Wi-Fi with everyone. So I'm removing all the pins. And if you want to participate, please turn on your camera. And Andy is going to help us take a photo. So everybody, Andy, when we are ready, when you're ready, let us know.
I'll take a few shots. So smile, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so that's page 1. Okay, so another one, smile. Okay, good. You're all set. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Andy. And thank you again. And we'll see you at the next ConservAction lecture. Bye, everybody.
Great. Thank you very much.
Bye.
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 Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.